The restaurant was not listed on any map, not because it was hidden, but because it didn't need to be found. Everyone who mattered already knew where it was. Tucked behind a velvet-troped entrance on a quiet corner of mid-century New York, it glowed every evening like a private sun, spilling amber light onto the pavement and the polished shoes of men who believed the world existed to serve them. Inside, the air always carried the same perfumaged wine, expensive cigars, and something sharper beneath it, something like power that had learned how to rot. It was the kind of place where laughter was loud but never warm, where the music played softly so secrets could travel further, and where the chandeliers reflected not only light, but ego. Dean Martin didn't belong to this world, at least not the way these men did. He was famous, yes. His name opened doors, his smile softened rooms, his voice could still entire ballrooms into silence. But fame and power are not the same currency. Fame invites admiration. Power demands permission. And this room was owned by men who had stopped asking. Dean hadn't planned to be there. That was the first truth. He had been pulled into the evening by a favor the old kind. The kind you repay not because you're afraid, but because once upon a time someone stood up for you when it cost them something. An aging pianist he knew had begged him to come. Said a friend of his worked there. Said she'd had a rough month. Said it would mean the world to her to see a familiar face in a place that rarely offered kindness. Dean had agreed without asking many questions. He often did. His life had taught him that the smallest gestures sometimes carried the heaviest weight. He arrived without announcement. No entourage, no flash of cameras. Just a man in a tailored suit, his coat draped casually over one arm, eyes calm, steps unhurried, head still turned. Of course they did. They always did. But curiosity and recognition were different from respect. And respect was what this room rarely gave. Her name was Elena. She wasn't meant to be noticed. That was part of the design. The staff here were trained to disappear, to glide between tables like shadows, to exist only as extensions of the guest's comfort. Elena wore the same black uniform as the others, but something about her presence refused to flatten. Maybe it was the way she stood straight without stiffness, dignified without defiance. Maybe it was her eyes, dark and steady, carrying a quiet that didn't beg to be filled. She moved with care, not fear. And in a room built on intimidation, that difference mattered. Dean saw her before he saw anyone else. She was setting down a bottle at a long central table where the loudest men sat. The table was surrounded by wealth and reputation, by tailored suits and gold watches and voices that carried the lazy confidence of people who had never been told no in a way that stuck. At the center of them sat a man everyone called Rossi, not because that was his name, because no one used his real one anymore. Names were for equals. Titles were for distance. Rossi didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The men around him laughed first, leaned in first, nodded first. His control was not theatrical. It was habitual. The kind built over years of being obeyed. Elena placed the bottle down carefully, twisted the cork, and began to pour. That was when it happened. No argument. No warning. No mistake. Rossi looked at her glass, then at her face, and something like mild amusement crossed his features, the way a man might look at a stain on a tablecloth. He said something quietly. Dean never heard what it was. And then, with a flick of his wrist so casual it could have been part of a conversation, he tilted his glass. The wine didn't splash. It streamed. A slow red line spilled over Elena's hairline, traced the curve of her cheek, darkened the collar of her uniform. The liquid caught the chandelier light as it fell, turning her into a still painting of humiliation. For half a second, no one in the room reacted. Not because they were shocked, because they were waiting. Then laughter came. Not from everyone, but from enough. It rolled across the table in uneven waves, a few sharp bursts, some quieter chuckles. A couple of men who laughed not because it was funny, but because silence would have been dangerous. The sound didn't fill the room. It poisoned it. Elena didn't cry out. She didn't step back. She didn't raise her hands to her face. She stood. Wine slid from her chin and dripped onto the white cloth. Her eyes lowered for a moment. Not in submission, but in something far more painful: containment. The kind people learn when reacting only makes things worse. When dignity has to be carried inward because the world has decided not to hold it for you. A manager rushed forward, already apologizing, already bending, already reaching for napkins as though the problem was the table, not the act. Alina gently took one, pressed it once to her cheek, and then, with a steadiness that hurt to watch, she turned as if to leave. That was when a chair moved. It was not slammed back. It was not dramatic. It was simply pushed. The sound it made against the floor was soft, but it was wrong, and everyone felt. Dean Martin stood. No toast. No joke. No smile. Just a man rising from his seat. He didn't walk quickly. He didn't need to. His presence changed the temperature of the space the way a door opening in winter changes a room. Conversations stalled. A few heads turned fully now, recognition sharpening into something more cautious. This was not a performer stepping into light. This was a man stepping into a moment. He crossed the floor and stopped beside Elena, up close. Could see her hands were trembling. Not wildly. Not visibly to anyone else. But enough. Enough to tell a story. Dean reached into his coat, took out a handkerchief white, neatly folded on, held it out to her. "For your face," he said gently. His voice was calm, almost soft, but it carried. He had spent a lifetime learning how to place words, so they landed exactly where he wanted. Alina hesitated. The room was watching. Rossi leaned back in his chair, studying them now with mild interest, like a man observing an interruption to his evening rather than a challenge to it. Dean didn't rush her. He didn't look at Rossi. He didn't look at the table. He looked only at her. "You don't deserve to wear someone else's cruelty," said quietly. She took the handkerchief as she dabbed her cheek. Dean turned, not dramatically, deliberately. His eyes met Rossi's, no anger in them, no threat, just a stillness that did not ask permission to exist. "You spilled your drink," Dean said. A few men snorted. Someone laughed once, uncertainly. Rossi smiled. "It happens." Dean nodded once, as if acknowledging a small, ordinary truth. "Yes," he said. "Accidents happen." Then he paused. "But respect is a choice." The smile on Rossi's face didn't disappear. It thinned. The air changed. The music somewhere in the back kept playing, unaware it had become inappropriate. A waiter froze mid-step. A glass stopped halfway to a mouth. Rossi tilted his head slightly. "You here to lecture me, Martin?" Dean's expression didn't shift. "I'm here to remind you," he replied, "that how a man treats someone who can't defend herself tells everyone exactly who he is." Chair scraped. One of Rossi's men shifted, leaning forward, eyes narrowing. Not because Dean was wrong. Because he was dangerous? Rossi studied him for a long moment. Then he glanced at Alina, still beside Dean, handkerchief in hand. Shoulders squared with a bravery she hadn't planned on needing tonight. He looked back at Dean. "This is my table," Rossi said. Dean didn't move. "But that is a person." Silence. Not empty silence. Weighted silence. The kind that bends rooms. And in that silence, something irreversible began. Because humiliation, when witnessed and unchallenged, becomes permission. But humiliation, when interrupted, it becomes exposure, and everyone in that room could feel it. This was no longer about spilled wine. It was about power being seen, and a man who refused to look away. The silence that followed Dean's words did not break naturally. It fractured. Somewhere near the back of the restaurant, a glass finally touched a table. The music faltered for half a second, as if the band sensed something had gone wrong. A nervous laugh tried to escape and died halfway out of someone's mouth. The room had not decided what this moment meant yet, and until it did, no one was certain how to breathe inside it. Rossi did not stand. That alone unsettled people. Men like him often rose quickly, theatrically, to establish physical dominance. But Rossi remained seated, one arm draped along the back of his chair. His posture relaxed in a way that suggested not control, but ownership. He looked at Dean as one might look at an unexpected stain on an expensive suit knot, angered, not alarmed. Merely curious how it had appeared and whether it would spread. "You're a long way from the stage," Rossi said at last, his voice smooth, almost conversational. "People come here to forget the world, not to be reminded of it." Dean held his gaze without stiffness, without bravado. "Then they chose the wrong place," he replied, "because the world is exactly what walks through those doors every night." A few men shifted. One glanced toward the entrance. Another toward the manager, who stood pale and uncertain, hands clasped as if in prayer. This was no longer a private humiliation. This was becoming a public fracture. Rossi's eyes flicked briefly back to Alina. She stood just behind Dean now. It's not hiding behind him, but anchored by him. The handkerchief was folded in her fingers. A faint stain of red still traced the edge of her collar. Her face was composed, but inside her chest something had begun to shake, loose something dangerous to a place like this. Not hope, exactly. Something more disruptive, recognition. Rossi smiled again, thinner this time. "Tell me something, Dean Martin. Does stepping in make you feel taller?" Dean didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned slightly toward Alina. "Would you like to sit down?" he asked her. The question alone landed harder than any insult could have. In this room, staff did not sit. They did not pause. They did not exist beyond function. Alina hesitated, eyes darting toward the manager, toward Rossi, toward the men at the table who now watched her like gamblers watching a final card turn. The old instinct urged her to refuse, to retreat, to make herself small and safe, but something in Dean's voice made the choice feel different. "Not rebellious human. There's a chair right there," Dean added, gently indicating the empty one beside him. Rossi watched closely now. Every movement mattered. Slowly, Alina pulled out the chair and sat. It was the softest sound in the room and one of the loudest. Rossi's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, not because a woman had sat, but because someone had invited her to, because a line had been crossed that could not be uncrossed. Power depends on unspoken agreements, and one had just been broken. "You're enjoying this," Rossi said. Dunn finally looked back at him. "No," he replied. "I'm correcting it." A ripple of unease moved across the table. Rossi leaned forward slightly, fingers lacing. "You think a word and a gesture fixes something? You think dignity is something you can hand out like a tip?" "No," Dean said. "I think dignity is something no one had the right to take." Rossi's smile disappeared. For the first time, the men around him sensed a shift. The air no longer felt indulgent. It felt alert. "You should go back to your seat," Rossi said quietly. Dean didn't move. "Why?" he asked. Rossi's eyes hardened. "Because you're disrupting my evening." Dean nodded slowly, as though considering that. "Then maybe," he said, "your evening deserves to be disrupted." That was when Rossi stood, not abruptly, carefully. The movement was deliberate, practiced, a reminder that he did not need speed to command space. He rose to his full height and straightened his jacket. He did not step closer to Dean. He didn't have to. Men like Rossi were used to others stepping back for them, but Dean didn't. They stood less than a yard apart now. Two very different kinds of presence occupying the same air. "You're protected by a name," Rossi said softly. "By nostalgia. By the comfort people feel when they hear your voice. Don't confuse that with invincibility." Dean's reply was equally quiet. "And you're protected by fear. Don't confuse that with respect." Around them, the restaurant had become a still life. No forks moved. No glasses lifted. Even the musicians had stopped playing, hands hovering over instruments they suddenly did not know how to touch. Rossi's eyes narrowed. But something else lived beneath that narrowing. Calculation. Because he understood crowds. He understood witnesses. He understood the danger of moments that lingered. "You want to make a point?" Rossi said. "Make it. Then go." Dean looked past him, around the room. He let his gaze rest on faces. On men who had laughed too quickly. On men who had looked away, on women who had said nothing because nothing had ever changed. When they did, then he spoke. Not loudly, but to everyone. "There's a lie this room runs on," he said. "That power makes behavior acceptable. That money rewrites manners. That cruelty becomes entertainment when the right people are watching." He paused. "That lie only works when no one interrupts it." He turned back to Rossi. "Tonight it was wine. Another night, it will be something else. It always escalates when no one pushes back." Rossi's mouth twitched. "You think you're pushing back?" "Right." Dean shook his head. "No," he said. "I'm standing still." The difference unsettled. More than any challenge would have, Dean then did. Something no one expected. He reached into his wallet and placed several bills on the table, far more than the meal was worth. "For the evening," he said calmly, "and for the mess." Rossi looked down at the money, then back up. "You think you can buy closure?" "I think," Dean replied, "that some debts shouldn't be carried forward." Then he turned to Alina. "You don't have to go back to work tonight," he said gently. "If you don't want to," her breath caught. "I need this job." Dean nodded. "I understand." He glanced at the manager. "And I trust," he added, "that she'll be treated with the same respect as anyone who walks in here." The manager swallowed. Hardin nodded. Rossi watched all of it too. Calmly, because men like him did. Not erupt when crossed, they recorded. Dean offered Alina his arm. She stood. This time, no one laughed as they walked toward the exit. The room parted in a way it never had before. Not out of reverence, not out of fear, but out of something far more dangerous to power. Awareness. The door opened. Cold night air rushed in. But before Dean stepped through, Rossi spoke one last time. "You've made something of her," he said. "Be careful. Things people notice tend to attract interest." Dean turned. "Then maybe," he said, "you should be careful what kind of interest you inspire." They left. The door closed, and only then did the room exhale. But Rossi did not sit. He remained standing, staring at the space Dean Martin had occupied. His reflection caught faintly in the dark glass of the door, because humiliation, when public, does not fade, it reorganizes. And somewhere beneath the music that slowly resumed, beneath the forced laughter, beneath the evening's attempt to reset itself, something else had begun. Not revenge, not anger, but something colder, a need to restore an order that had just been challenged. And Dean Martin had no idea yet how deeply Elena's life and his own were now, entangled with men who never forgot the feeling of being exposed. Alina did not sleep that night. The city outside her small apartment window never truly went quiet. But there was a different kind of noise keeping her awake now. Not traffic, not sirens, thought. The kind that circles instead of moving forward. The kind that replays moments, not as they happened, but as they might have ended if one word had been different, if one man had stayed seated. If courage had not chosen her table, she sat at her kitchen table long after midnight, the handkerchief folded neatly beside her cup of untouched tea. The faint scent of cologne still clung to it, warm, old-fashioned, familiar in a way she couldn't place. It felt strange to own something so small that carried the weight of a room changing. Her life before that evening had been built on careful math. How long she could stretch each paycheck. Which streets were safer after dark. How many hours of exhaustion she could tolerate before mistakes began to happen. She worked 6 nights a week, saved almost nothing, sent part of every check back home to a mother whose hands were failing faster than her pride would admit. There was no space in that arithmetic for moments. Certainly not for scenes. And definitely not for men like Dean Martin, stepping into her world like they belonged there. She touched the stain on her collar where the wine had soaked through. It had not washed out completely. A shadow remained. She hadn't tried very hard to remove it, not because she wanted to remember the humiliation, but because she didn't want to forget the interruption. Across the city, in a building where the windows were always too clean to reflect anything honestly, Rossi sat alone. He had dismissed his company early. The laughter in the restaurant had not followed him home. Laughter never did. His office was quiet in the way only controlled spaces could bathe carpet. Heavy desk, walls that held history without displaying it. He poured himself a drink and did not taste it. On his desk lay a single photograph, not of Dean Martin, of Alina. Someone had taken it earlier that night. Outside the restaurant, just as she and Dean had stepped onto the sidewalk. It wasn't a dramatic picture. No raised voices. No gestures. Just two figures caught mid-stride, Dean speaking, Alina listening. Her face turned slightly toward him. But Rossi did not study faces. He studied connections. He tapped the edge of the photo once with his finger, then set it down. "You don't make people visible," he said quietly to the empty room. "You make them vulnerable." He reached for the phone. By morning, Alina noticed the change. It wasn't dramatic. That would have been easier to recognize. It was subtle. A pause too long when she handed over her coat at the staff entrance. A different manager than usual assigning her section. A man she had never seen before standing near the bar, pretending not to watch her. Nothing happened, and yet everything felt closer. The tables were louder. The glances heavier. The space behind her back no longer felt empty. She told herself she was imagining it. Trauma has a way of sharpening harmless details into weapons. She repeated that as she poured water, as she balanced trays, as she smiled when spoken to. She was good at pretending the air was neutral. But when her shift ended, she did not go straight home. She walked past 2 blocks she normally turned on, past the bakery with the yellow lights, past the bus stop where she usually waited. She did not know what she was looking for, only that standing still felt incorrect. She reached the river before she realized where she was going. The water moved with the kind of patience only things without fear possessed. She leaned against the railing and let the cold night wind touch her face. That was when a voice spoke behind her. "You don't walk like someone without something on her mind." She turned. Dean Martin stood a few feet away, coat buttoned, hat low, hands in his pockets, as if he had always been there, and she had simply caught up to him. Her first reaction was disbelief. Her second was something dangerously close to relief. "I didn't know you lived near here," she said. "I don't," he replied. "But I thought you might." She frowned slightly. "Why?" "Because when people are shaken," he said, "they either go home or they go where things move." She glanced back at the river. Which one is safer? Dean considered. Neither, but one is honest. They stood in silence for a moment, the city breathing around them. "I shouldn't have sat," Alina said suddenly. The words surprised her as much as him. "I keep thinking, maybe if I hadn't, it wouldn't feel like this now. Maybe it would have just ended." Dean looked at her. Really looked. "Some things don't end," he said. "They only hide better." She hesitated. "Something feels different." "It is," Dean replied. "And I'm sorry." She searched his face. "Sorry. For reminding you," he said, "that you're allowed to be seen." That was when the first car passed slowly behind them. Black, polished, quiet. It did not stop, but it did not hurry. Alina watched it go, her chest tightening. "That's been happening." Dean followed the car with his eyes until it disappeared into traffic. "Has anyone spoken to you?" he asked. "No." "Good," he said gently. "Then nothing has happened yet." Her brow furrowed. Yet Dean turned to face the river. When someone's authority depends on atmosphere, they don't strike first. They surround. They let the air do the work. Alina hugged her arms around herself. "I don't want trouble." "No one ever does," Dean said. "But that doesn't mean you invited it." He reached into his pocket and took out a card. No title, no address, just a phone number and his name. "If at any point," said, "you feel like something is wrong before you can explain why it's wrong, you call me." She accepted it, fingers brushing his. "You don't even know me," she said. Dean smiled faintly. "I know enough." Another car passed. This one slowed more. Alina felt it before she saw it. The way the air tightened, the way attention pressed without touch. Dean stepped half a pace closer, not in front of her, not behind her. Beside her, the car rolled on, but it did not vanish from her thoughts. or his. Because somewhere across the city, Rossi's world was beginning to arrange itself quietly around two people who had never belonged in it, and the most dangerous phase had begun. The phase where nothing obvious happens. The phase where power waits. The first thing Alina noticed that morning was the absence of noise, not the city's noise, that never truly left, but the inner one, the anxious hum that had followed her since the night at the restaurant. The feeling of being subtly watched, the quiet anticipation of something wrong waiting to introduce itself. When she opened her eyes, there was a stillness in her chest she hadn't felt in days. It was fragile, temporary, but real. She made coffee, watered the plant on her windowsill, folded the handkerchief, and placed it back in her bag, though she didn't know why she still carried it. Perhaps because it reminded her that dignity could exist outside her own insistence, that sometimes it arrived from other people, unannounced, and changed the shape of what followed. She left for work with no plan other than to move through the day without shrinking. By the time she reached the restaurant, something was wrong. The doorman did not meet her eyes. The usual manager was not there. Instead, two men in tailored suits stood just inside the entrance, not eating, not speaking, simply existing in the way men exist when they have not come for pleasure. One of them glanced at her and then away. The other watched her pass without hiding it. Inside, the tables were set. The chandeliers lit. The place looked unchanged. It felt staged. Alina tied her apron slowly, heart finding a different rhythm than it had known before. She moved through the first hour on instinct alone, delivering plates, refilling glasses, answering requests. Nothing happened. That was what frightened her. Then a message reached her from the front. "Private room," manager said quietly. "They're asking for you." Her throat tightened. "Who?" The manager didn't answer. He didn't need to. The private room was rarely used in daylight. It held a long, polished table, too many chairs, and a painting that pretended to be art while functioning as surveillance. The air inside was cooler. Controlled Rossi stood near the far end, his hands resting lightly on the back of a chair. No glass, no entourage, just him. "You wanted to see me?" Alina asked. Rossi turned. He studied her for a long moment. As if she were an unfamiliar object he was deciding how to categorize. "You've been difficult to forget," he said calmly. She said nothing. "You were invisible." Rossi continued. "And then someone made you noticeable." Her fingers curled slightly at her sides. "Do you know what visibility costs?" he asked. "I know what invisibility costs," she replied. Rossi's lips curved faintly. "Good answer." Step closer, not into her space, but into the room's center. "Where influence lived, you created a disturbance," he said. "Not because of what you did, because of what you represented. Rooms like mine depend on agreement, on unspoken lines. When those lines are crossed, everyone becomes nervous, and nervous people look for reasons." She met his gaze. "Then maybe they should." For the first time, Rossi's expression shifted, not to anger, to something like recognition. "You've changed," he said. She thought of the river, the card in her pocket, the quiet decision she had made that morning. "Yes," she said. "I have." Rossi exhaled slowly. "I could make this difficult." Lena nodded. "I know. I could make sure no one here gives you a shift again." She nodded again. "I know." He tilted his head. "And yet you're still standing here." "Psst," she said. Rossi looked at her carefully, as if measuring the dimensions of a room he no longer fully controlled. Then he smiled faintly. "You're braver than most," no, Elena said. "I'm just not alone anymore." The words hung between them. Rossi's gaze sharpened. "Is that what he told you?" "No," she replied. "That's what I discovered." There was a knock at the door. Not the restaurant knock, the deliberate one. Rossi did not turn immediately. When he did, Dean Martin stood in the doorway. No coat, no hat, no performance, just presence. The two men regarded each other across the private room. The silence thick with everything they both understood but did not need to voice. "I wondered when you'd come," Rossi said. Dean stepped inside. I wondered how long you'd wait. Alina felt the tension shift. Not escalate. Clarify. You've made her bold, Rossi said. Dean shook his head. She always was. I just didn't pretend otherwise. Rossi regarded him. You realize I could still undo what you started. Oh, Dean nodded. You could try. Rossi studied him. You're not afraid. Dean's voice was quiet. I'm careful. There's a difference. He glanced at Alina. Are you all right? She breathed. I am. Dean turned back to Rossi. Then I'm done here. Rossi raised an eyebrow. That's it? Dean considered. No, he said. This is... He reached into his pocket and placed something on the table. Not money, not a threat, a small envelope. Rossi did not touch it. What's that? He asked. Names, Dean replied. In patterns, in places. The kind people talk about when they believe no one is listening. You run a quiet world, Rossi. But quiet doesn't mean unseen. Rossi's jaw tightened. You think you're exposing me? No, Dean said. I think you've been exposed for a long time. I'm just reminding you that some people prefer light. Rossi's eyes darkened. You think that frightens me? Dean shook his head. No, but it should exhaust you. Rossi stared at the envelope. Then, slowly, he pushed it back across the table. You won't use it, he said. Dean met his gaze. That depends on you. Silence stretched. Finally, Rossi stepped back. Take her, he said, and go. Alina did not move. She looked at Dean. He nodded once. They walked out. Together, past the long table, past the chandeliers, past the space where humiliation had once stood. Uncontested, no one stopped them. Outside, the city moved as it always had. Cars, voices, wind, but Alina felt lighter with every step. They reached the sidewalk. She stopped. What happens now? She asked. Dean looked at her. That depends on what you choose. She thought of her careful arithmetic. Her invisible years? The night wine had fallen from someone else's glass and altered her trajectory. I don't think I'll be going back, she said. Dean smiled. Good, he replied. Then something real can begin. She held out the handkerchief. He shook his head. Keep it for what? For the day you don't need it anymore, he said. And remember, you never truly did. They stood there a moment longer. Two. People who had shared a room that tried to teach them something false, and had answered it with something truer, because the loudest power in the world is fear, but the only one that lasts is dignity.